thought it was quite bold of her, actually. She's normally a bit more fleet on her feet, I think, to sort of dodge the question a little bit more. But no, she was adamant that they haven't seen any evidence.
So we were watching closely, and there was no indication to the United States that any of that enriched uranium was moved prior to the strike.
From any of the sites?
Correct.
And then one more.
We're joined here on P&O and Friends by Harriet Alexander, a US correspondent, joining us from the other side of the Atlantic. Hi to you, Harriet.
Hello, John.
Hi. It is always, I don't know if entertaining is the word, but I've got to say I find it gripping, whatever happens at these regular briefings. I want to pick up on a couple of thought points and get your thoughts on that. A good deal from the President's press secretary on the aftermath of the bombing of those Iranian nuclear sites. A few things leapt out for me. Keen to get Scarlett and Matt's view on this too. But we heard the President's press secretary tell us that as far as the President and the White House was concerned, they destroyed Iran's stock of enriched uranium, a consequence of the bombing. He said, and we've had reports, including today, for European governments from European intelligence agencies saying that that uranium stock of enriched uranium was not destroyed by the bombing. So a flat contradiction there. And there were reports since the bombing, but about events before the bombing, of caravans of lorries carrying material away from Fordo, presumed to be including enriched uranium. And so we hear the President simply, and his spokesperson there, flatly denying that. It's a clear contradiction, and you have to wonder, as in other areas which we might get to, how they can be sure of saying that, because it doesn't stop them saying it, Harriet.
Yes, absolutely. I thought that as well, John. It was very striking that she said that, because that goes beyond what Pete Hegseth, the Defense Secretary, and Dan Kane, who's the Joint Chief of Staffs, what they said this morning in their press conference. They said that it had been a successful mission. They actually showed some quite remarkable video of these bombs being dropped into the shafts of the ventilation shafts. It's really quite striking how they work, because they're incredibly precise. The bombs go in and then they explode underground. So, on the one hand, the mission can be very successful technically, operationally. They talked a lot about, the refueling and how impressive the flying was, etc. And sure, technically that was a success, but we still don't know whether it's achieved the results that were intended, which is the destruction of the enriched uranium. And they've been pressed about this repeatedly. Hegseth and Kane were a little bit more succinct, I thought, this morning on it, but Caroline Levitt just now, she said, no, we haven't seen any evidence that this enriched uranium was moved. Well, they haven't seen any evidence, but there's all these reports of this convoy of vehicles, as you said, being summoned and leaving the site ahead. So, yeah, a flat out contradiction. I thought it was quite bold of her, actually. She's normally a bit more fleet on her feet, I think, to sort of dodge the question a little bit more. But no, she was adamant that they haven't seen any evidence. So interesting.
Well, no, the President's press secretary is the President's press secretary. She doesn't tend to be shy of taking on the question. It's a flat contradiction, even a bit of abuse when she doesn't like what they're saying. That's the way business is done in the West Wing, apparently, these days. And what do you think of this, Scarlett and Matt? And just on that narrow point, the President and his team there, just taking their own position on the utter complete success of the bombing of the Iranian nuclear sites. I mean, there we had Caroline Levitt tell us that it had made the world safer because of the President's decisiveness. Look, there's no doubt it clearly did set back the Iranian programme, maybe really quite significantly. But as for how safe and for how long, again, another question, and something of an open one.
The thing he's desperate for, though, isn't it, is to be seen as a peacemaker, to be seen as someone who, I mean, he probably wants to win the Nobel Peace Prize. I think that's probably something that he's desperate to do. And as long as we're talking about how successful the mission was, he's probably happy about the narrative that is around his leadership. Yes, he would much prefer that they had hard evidence that they'd completely destroyed all of Iran's sort of weapons capability. But if we're in a debate about quite how safe President Trump has made America, or quite how decisive it is he very decisive or very, very decisive? Yeah. I think they won't really mind that is the conversation. Ultimately, the facts of this, that doesn't really matter to this White House, does it? I don't think they really care about that. What they care about is the narrative. And at the moment, he looks strong, he looks decisive, he looks like someone who as she put it, is keen to pursue peace but through strength. That's the image they want to project, and all he will care about is the image that's projected. Yeah,
and when it comes to reports that don't fit the narrative, we know how they're dealt with. I mean, the president was calling them scum yesterday, referring to some national news organisations. Here we had Caroline Levitt today a moment ago talking yet again about the fake news media, and the Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth has been tearing into the media as well. And this stuff, Scarlett, this plays very well with their base, and that's who it's intended for. America is a fundamentally divided society, politically and socially, and tearing into the other side, and the media, the mainstream media, is seen very much as carrying the flag for the other side, plays well with the people that they want to please.
Unfortunately, attacks on the media do, and America is much more polarised and has a completely polarised and bifurcated media system, much more so in the UK, and I think that's something that a lot of Brits find it quite hard to get their heads around. But actually, what's quite interesting on this issue is that actually it's not as polarised as you might think, in that I'm very interested to see how this plays out with Donald Trump's base. I think he's in quite significant danger here. His base are not being carried with him on this issue. They're split on the question of how involved America should be in anything overseas, quite fundamentally split. And that's
talk about Donald Trump voters here.
Yeah, exactly. Donald Trump's voters. So there's split at the top of MAGA as well, with some of the sort of his top advisors, people like Steve Bannon on one side, and then other people who are sort of more hawkish in their natural instincts, people like Marco Rubio, even though he has now really towed the MAGA line. So there's splits at the top, but his base is divided, and it's actually one of the very few issues where Trump hasn't managed to carry his base along. So even if you poll, for example, whether they were right to bomb nuclear weapons in the first place, less than 7 in 10 of Trump voters thought he was right. Now, Keir Starmer might dream of those sorts of numbers for Labour support, but in America, especially in polarised America that we've been used to for the last decade or so, that's very low. And actually, this is a moment where he risks losing his base, and I think politically speaking, that's what I'm most interested in.
That's really interesting, Scarlett. I mean, how up to date is the data on this? Because I think maybe a week ago I saw 53% of Trump voters in the last election were not happy about the Iran mission. Has that changed?
And when you poll whether or not Iran should have nuclear weapons, Americans on both sides are pretty emphatic in saying no, absolutely not.
That's kind of an easy one.
Well, yeah, exactly. That one's an easy one. But in terms of the actual intervention and the style in which it's intervened, we have polling that's come out over the last week. There's no polling in relation to this particular press statement that we've had just then. But the polling over the last week or so shows a pretty mixed bag for the president.
I mean, Harriet Alexander, I mean, a couple of points there before you leave us. And again, Harriet, great of you to join us this evening. On NATO, we were yesterday talking about in a great depth about the NATO summit at The Hague. After the summit was over, after the members of NATO agreed to that 5% increase in spending towards the mid 2030s, the Secretary General of NATO told us that there would be a phasing back of American military power in the continent of Europe, and that it would be replaced by European military power as the NATO partners built up their defence capabilities, spent more money. And then we just heard Caroline Levitt talking about America gaining to the tune of trillions. Now look, President Trump uses trillions and billions almost interchangeably. We know that. But it does talk about spending a great deal of money on defence as a consequence of the deal with NATO, which does imply, well, maybe they envisage a significant scaling down of American commitment in Europe, in NATO, Harriet.
Well, it's interesting that, they've now set this 5% target for NATO spending, but not even the US spends 5% of its GDP on defense. The US spends a lot. It's about 3.5%, which is much more than many other countries. So, I mean, they would have to stretch to meet that themselves. I think, Trump is taking this as a win, of course. They are saying that that Europe is finally waking up to the fact that America cannot be there protecting it all the time, that they need to take some more responsibility for their actions. We know very much what Pete Hegseth thinks about this because of that leaked signal chat. Do you remember from several months ago where he said that it was in all caps pathetic that Europe was freeloading as he saw it? So, the Americans are quite pleased with the outcome of this. They are taking the NATO summit as a win. And I think, interestingly, to Scarlett's point about American public opinion and MAGA public opinion in particular, I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens over the next sort of couple of days and weeks, because if it calms down, MAGA will accept that Trump needed to do this. They will praise him for strength, and then they'll move on.